Rob, and here we're going to look at OLTP versus OLAP use cases, and we'll look at where Ebean fits and when we should start using our own SQL. So here I've got a quadrant, and on this left hand side we've got OLTP, on the right hand side we've got OLAP, and at the top we have simple use cases, and at the bottom complex use cases. So in summary, on the left hand side we have SQL that we mostly can generate using ORM, some manual SQL that we would supply. And on the right hand side we have SQL that we mostly need to write by hand or use OLAP specific tools, so not even use ORM. So if we're looking at SQL, and just before I start, SQL is not the only player in this OLAP space. Of course we have multi-dimensional databases and graph analysis and other tools, so there are other things in here, but we're going to talk about SQL and Ebean. So from a SQL perspective, on this OLAP space we have window functions, common table expressions, over, with, lateral, a bunch of keywords in SQL that we don't really generate in Ebean, and we don't really expect to generate in Ebean. In this OLTP simple space, here we have relatively flat result sets going into relatively flat beans. So that's relatively straightforward and simple, and there's no real big difficulty there. What we have in the more complex quadrant down here for OLTP is complex object graphs. So we have nested many's, multiple many's, and pagination. So these nested graphs are more difficult to produce efficiently in SQL, and more painful to do manually. What we will see over time is SQL come down into the space with SQL multiset. So as SQL multiset gets more wider support, that means that SQL will be able to come down to these more complex graphs, and that will be pretty good. What ORM brings in this complex graph space is a persistence context and load context. So these are the two things that help us build object graphs, and if you like, the load context is the main thing that is dealing with complex graphs with pagination. So this is if you like, doing the query joins and batch lazy loading and things like that. ORM also brings L2 cache and Elasticsearch integration usually as well, and it also brings in some nice OLTP orientated features. So page lists, things like find total row count combined with a top 100 query. So that just makes that nice and easy doing those two queries. History support, soft delete, etc. Support for more interesting types like JSON in the database and database array types. So that's good. What we have with Ebean is Ebean has an OLTP focus. So it's the main function for Ebean is to deal with OLTP issues and problems. Developing OLTP solutions, really. Now, firstly, I wanted to remind people we sometimes forget to think relationally. We have an ORM, it's good ORM, and we can solve lots of problems really easily with it. But sometimes, we shouldn't forget that problems can be solved in a relational way, and it's just slightly simpler, slightly easier approach, and entity beans and things like that. So don't forget that the relational approach is still valid and still, if you like, simple and easy to use in this space. From an OLAP perspective, Ebean pokes its nose into this, if you like, simple reporting use cases. So here we have entities can be based on views, they don't have to be based on tables. So with your view, you can hide sort of a complex reporting type SQL. We can use @formula to do aggregations. We can have entities that don't have IDs, so these entities orientated for reporting really. And we can use raw SQL. So this is probably the most important feature on this space, on the reporting and OLAP space. So it's kind of got two forms. So we can give Ebean a straight JDBC result set, or we can give Ebean SQL. And if we give Ebean SQL, it can augment it. It can add to the where clause. It can, override the order by clause and add pagination and things like that. So that's an important feature. But the main point here is that this is SQL that we give Ebean rather than Ebean generating the SQL. On the complex graph case, Ebean gives us the ability to add a bit of native. So we can add raw expressions into our query. So we can have Ebean generate 80% of the query and then have a raw database predicate added in. So that's like a Postgres specific database function and things like that. We can also completely use native SQL. So we can give Ebean, if you like, the origin query. That's for the entire origin SQL statement, or Ebean can augment that, add to the where clause, etc. And then we can invoke lazy loading and secondary queries from that as well. So this is really a mechanism where we're bypassing Ebean's SQL generation and just putting in our own SQL. So that's good too. The other thing that gets us down into these complex cases is the load context. So this is like an internal thing that doesn't get talked about much, but the load context does the query joins, and it does the batch lazy loading. It does the efficient object graph construction for these complex cases. And Ebean does very well here. If we compare ourselves to, for example, Hibernate and Eclipse Link, if they do multiple too manys, they will produce a SQL Cartesian product, which is pretty inefficient, highly dangerous if you like. And if we combine pagination with a fetch join to a many, they will also produce what I think are fairly poor implementations. So it's Ebean's load context that deals with that complex object graph construction, and if you like, that's its little hero feature for doing these complex things. In terms of the caching, Ebean has Elasticsearch integration. So here we're augmenting just normal L2 caching with Elasticsearch, so we can offload OLTP traffic, read traffic to Elasticsearch, and use inverted indexes. And this is good. Elasticsearch also plays in this analytics space. So Ebean doesn't really do much at the moment in terms of exposing Elasticsearch's analytics capabilities, but we could add some functionality here. And so just to finish off, in terms of where Ebean is at and where we want to be, in terms of the simple space, Ebean can't do a single column query where the column is not the ID. So if we've got products, we can go select SKU from product, where SKU is say a unique key or something like that. Then Ebean can't do that as an ORM query. We kind of need to do a SQL select query for that. So that would be nice to add. In the complex space here, Ebean has good support for types, including JSON and database and Postgres array type, but we can do better here with array types. We can add support for range types and GIS types and things like that. So that would be nice to get some better type support to bring us down here. And in terms of the OLAP space, we could do some better support for aggregation formulas, so we can make this formula a little bit nicer. But in this space, Ebean is really orientated towards raw SQL, so SQL that we give Ebean as opposed to SQL that Ebean will generate. So Ebean is never really going to generate complex OLAP SQL. So that's it. That's how we see Ebean in terms of SQL. Cheers.